The stars burned in the void, distant and cold, indifferent to the fire and fury that raged below. Beneath their silent watch, the world of Grimdark 4 was a graveyard of war. A planet once teeming with imperial life now lay in ruin, its cities reduced to crumbling spires, its fields scorched to ash. The air itself trembled with the echoes of battle. The distant thunder of artillery, the ceaseless drumming of bolter fire, and the primal roars of something far older than words. And yet, above this world of death, something new had come. Something loud, something green, from the heavens, like a storm of madness. The Waaagh had arrived. The void crackled as hulking orc warships, slabs of scrap metal and brute ingenuity, punched through the planet's atmosphere. They did not land with grace or precision. They crashed, smashing into the earth like meteors, belching fire and shrapnel, crushing the ruins beneath them. Massive rusted drop pods, shaped like iron fists, hurtled down in their thousands, their impact shaking the bones of the world. And from the wreckage of each, the orcs poured forth, great hulking brutes, clad in jagged armor and wielding weapons that spat smoke and flame, stomped onto the battlefield with the reckless joy of beasts let loose from their cages. Their war cries filled the air, a cacophony of brutal laughter, guttural roars, and the mindless unifying chant that bound them together in their endless hunger for battle. At the heart of this green tide stood war boss Ruk Firefang, taller than the rest, broader, his jagged armor wreathed in the flames of battle. His massive choppa half-axe, half-chainsaw gleamed in the firelight as he surveyed the broken world before him. His single remaining eye, burning like an ember beneath his heavy brow, narrowed with savage delight. "Oh, aye, lads," he bellowed, his voice rolling across the battlefield like thunder. "Disiri planet's already in the middle of a right proper scrap." A chorus of laughter and agreement rumbled through his warriors, their tusked grins gleaming in the firelight. "Imperial Finken days in charge," Firefang growled, his massive boot crushing the skull of a long-dead guardsman. "Dem tyrannid bugjits swarmin' all over, but there's one Fing day ain't got." He paused, raising his arms wide as though embracing the very sky. "I ain't got a proper witch." The response was deafening. The ground shook as thousands of orcs slammed their fists against armor, fired their guns into the sky, or simply screamed their war cry to the heavens. The sound of it rippled through the ruins, stirring even the dust from its slumber. This was not merely an invasion, it was not conquest. This was the Waaagh, an unstoppable force of battle-hungry orcs, drawn across the stars not by strategy or duty, but by pure, unrelenting instinct. They fought because that was what they were made to do, and Firefang would lead them to the greatest fight of their lives. But Firefang was not just any war boss. He was not content with mere slaughter. He had heard the whispers, the legends, the prophecy of Gork's burnin' gaze. Somewhere on this world, beneath the ruins and the blood, lay something mighty. A flame that had burned for untold ages, waiting for the strongest orc to claim it. Some said it was a weapon, some said it was a sign. Firefang did not care what it was. He only knew that it was meant for him. And so, as the Waaagh spread across Grimdark 4 like wildfire, he would hunt, he would burn, and he would claim the fire that would make him the mightiest war boss in the galaxy. The Imperium was not prepared. In the towering remains of Hive Caradon, the last surviving Imperial stronghold, Commissar Darnik Holt stood atop the fortress walls, his coat whipping in the wind, his jaw clenched in iron resolve. Below him, the last of the Astra Militarum scrambled to prepare for the onslaught. The men of the 42nd Gendarian Rifles moved with the precision of the damned, loading their weapons, checking their armor, knowing, deep in the marrow of their bones, that they would not survive the battle to come. Holt did not lie to his men. "There is no reinforcement," he growled, pacing along the line of soldiers, his voice sharp as a blade. "There is no retreat. This is the last stand of Grimdark 4, and the enemy is here." His hand clenched into a fist as the distant horizon darkened, the smoke of burning ruins swirling into the sky. Make peace with your gods if you have them. Make peace with your sins. But know this: you will die as warriors of the Imperium. 100 voices barked in unison, "For the Emperor." Holt turned back toward the battlefield. Already the first waves of orcs were visible, moving like a green tide through the shattered landscape, and beyond them something else moved, a darker shadow slithering through the ruins, shifting and adapting its movements too perfect, too silent. The Tyranids, always learning, always evolving. They too had come to feast upon the dying world. Holt exhaled sharply, his gloved fingers tightening around the grip of his bolt pistol. Orcs, Tyranids. Two unstoppable forces of death converging upon a single world, and between them, a handful of men. A storm was coming, and it would burn with fire and blood. The Waaagh had begun. The first impact of battle came in the form of a gargantuan boom. A crude, jagged war maner, barely held together by the sheer belief of orc engineering, hurtled through the sky, its engines belching smoke and flame. It crashed into the outer walls of the hive, tearing through ceramite and adamantium as though they were paper. And from the wreckage, the orcs poured forth. Massive, laughing, screaming warriors, swinging brutal cleavers, firing ramshackle weapons that spat fire and death in every direction. Their battle cries drowned out the screams of the dying, their brutal joy a sound more terrible than war itself. The Imperials opened fire. Lost guns burned the night, heavy bolters roared, and plasma cannons howled as they rained death upon the tide of green flesh. But for every orc that fell, 10 more took its place, driven by the savage, unbreakable force of the Waaagh. The two powerful Holt stood firm, his pistol barking with each precise measured shot, but even he could see the truth. The walls would not hold, and somewhere deep within the battlefield, Firefang roared in triumph. Tonight, the flames of battle had been lit, and Grimdark 4 would burn. The world of Grimdark 4 had become a theater of unrelenting destruction, where the sky itself seemed to weep fire and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal, charred flesh, and the ozone crackle of discharged energy weapons. Smoke curled from the remains of shattered spires, drifting through the ruins like the last breath of the planet itself. In the distance, the horizon flickered with the dull glow of distant infernos, the remnants of manufactorums and hab blocks set ablaze by the madness of war. The very land trembled beneath the endless barrage of artillery, each detonation carving new scars into a world that had already been stripped of its dignity, its hope, and its future. Amidst this apocalyptic landscape, Commissar Darnik Holt stood upon the broken ramparts of Hive Caradon, his heavy coat flapping in the embers of the dying city. The weight of his rank pressed upon him like a chain of iron, the burden of command manifesting in the deep-set lines of his face and the tired, almost haunted gleam in his steel-gray eyes. He watched as the orcs advanced, their numbers swelling like an unstoppable tide, a living wave of violence and madness that rolled across the corpse of the city with a terrible, ecstatic hunger. Holt clenched his gloved hands behind his back, feeling the worn leather creak beneath his grip. 1,000 thoughts warred within his mind, not of strategy or tactics, for those were meaningless now. A final stand was all that remained, but of something deeper, something darker. A question that had gnawed at the edges of his soul since the day he first donned the black of the commissariat. Was this the fate of all men, to stand upon the ruins of their dreams and their empires, waiting for the end? A voice broke through his contemplation, harsh yet edged with a kind of wearied determination. "Sir, the orcs will reach the lower gates within the hour. Our heavy bolters are running dry. We've already lost the outer defenses." Holt turned slowly, his gaze settling upon Lieutenant Garen Voss, a man barely past his 3rd decade of life, yet aged beyond his years by the relentless churn of war. His face was gaunt, his uniform tattered, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he clutched his lasgun with the grip of a man who had long since accepted his fate but refused to let go of it. There was a time, Holt mused, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken history, when men stood upon walls not to defend their deaths, but to guard their homes, their families, their children, who laughed in the streets below. There was a time when war was not the only thing that defined our existence. Tell me, Lieutenant, do you believe that time ever truly existed, or is it merely another lie we tell ourselves to make our own destruction more palatable? Voss hesitated, his lips parting as if to answer, but no words came. For what answer could there be? In the distant past, before the age of the Imperium, before the great march of the Emperor's legions, there had been stories of golden ages, of human ambition reaching for the stars, with the pure, untarnished desire for knowledge and discovery. But those stories were just that, stories. There was no golden age, no time of peace, no mythic past where men were free from the shackles of war. There was only the Imperium, the great machine that ground its people to dust in the name of survival. And beyond that, only darkness. "I don't know, sir," Voss admitted at last, his voice quiet, almost ashamed. "All I've ever known is this." Holt nodded, as if he had expected as much. "Then we die as we lived, Lieutenant, not as men, but as weapons, spent cartridges in the arsenal of an empire that has long since forgotten the meaning of victory. The moment passed, and the cold grip of reality reclaimed them both. Below, the orcs had begun their final charge. The ground quaked beneath their advance. A stampede of monstrous bodies clad in jagged, rusted armor, their weapons rattling and roaring with the crude, brutal energy of machines built solely for the purpose of destruction. Their war cries filled the sky, a relentless Waaagh that reverberated across the ruins, rattling bones, shaking the very foundations of the hive. Among them, leading the charge, Warboss Rakruk Firefang stood atop a hulking, barely functional battle wagon, his jagged-toothed grin wide with exhilaration. Flames licked at the edges of his heavy reinforced armor, the crude glyphs of Gork and Mork glowing with a dull, malevolent light. His single, red-glowing eye, his lucky eye, he called it, scanned the battlefield with the hunger of a predator on the scent of blood. Firefang did not contemplate war. He did not strategize or philosophize. To him, battle was not a means to an end, nor was it dictated by political ambition or territorial gain. Battle was the end, the only thing that mattered, the only thing that ever had. "Dare it is, boys," he roared, his voice a primal force of nature carrying over the battlefield like rolling thunder. "The biggest fight in the whole galaxy, just waiting for us to get stuck in. This is what we live for, what we fight for, what we Waaagh for." His warband answered with an ear-splitting chorus of agreement, their weapons raised high, their engines howling with unchecked fury. The city before them was a carcass, a rotting corpse of imperial arrogance and false hope, and they were the scavengers come to pick it clean. Yet even as Firefang reveled in the sheer, unrelenting momentum of his Waaagh, something deeper churned within the depths of his crude, instinct-driven mind, something that had been there since he first set foot upon this world. A calling, an unseen force that tugged at the edges of his perception, whispering through the flames and the smoke. The legend of Gork's burning gaze. Firefang was not like other war bosses. He did not merely seek battle for the sake of it. He sought the greatest battle of them all. The fight that would make all others pale in comparison, the conflict that would burn itself into the bones of the universe, the Waaagh that would never end. And something told him, something deep, something old, that the secret to that battle lay buried beneath the ruins of this dying world. Was it a weapon, a force of nature, a prophecy? Firefang did not care for such details. All he knew was that he would find it, and when he did, the stars themselves would tremble beneath the might of the greatest Waaagh in history. And so, as the orcs smashed into the crumbling defenses of Hive Caradon, as bolter fire and flame met rusted cleavers in savage brutality, as blood ran in rivers and the walls trembled beneath the weight of the green tide, the real battle began. Not just for Grimdark the Four, not just for the Imperium, but for the fate of war itself. The sky above Hive Caradon had become a battlefield of its own, a swirling tempest of smoke and fire, where the dying embers of a once great city were carried aloft by the winds of war, casting ghostly shadows upon the ruins below. The heavens themselves seemed to convulse under the weight of destruction, the dull, muted light of distant stars struggling to pierce through the thick haze of war. The air crackled with the electric pulse of lasgun fire, the distant howl of artillery, the muffled detonations of distant explosions, and beneath it all, beneath the screaming wind and the rolling thunder of destruction, there was the ever-present, unrelenting roar of the orcs. It was not merely a sound, but a force, a presence that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the city, growing louder, deeper, more consuming with each passing second. The walls of the hive would not hold. Commissar Darnick Holt knew this truth as he stood atop the battlements, his coat hanging heavy with dust and blood, his bolt pistol firm in his grip, his gaze set upon the writhing green tide that surged ever forward. There was no order to the orcs' advance, no careful strategy or measured approach, only speed, only fury, only an all-consuming hunger to tear, to break, to destroy. Their crude, jagged armor gleamed in the flickering firelight. Their grotesque weapons, little more than scraps of iron bolted together and infused with primal violence, clashed and thundered with each brutal swing. And at their head, like a god of war carved from sheer, unyielding brutality, stood Rook Grook Firefang. The war boss loomed above the horde, his massive form adorned with plates of rusted iron, each dent and scar upon his armor telling the story of 100 battles, each deep gash upon his flesh a mark of triumph, a testament to his existence as a creature of pure, unrelenting war. His red burning eye, the crude mechanical replacement that had been driven into his skull long ago, gleamed with a hunger that could never be sated, a hunger that was not merely for victory, but for the fight itself. Firefang did not simply crave war. He was war, a being of pure, distilled destruction, a force of nature given flesh and iron. "Look at it, lads," he bellowed, his voice a rolling seismic force that carried over the battlefield, cracking through the air like a thunderclap. "This is the stuff. This is what we live for. Look at them humigets. Hidden behind their walls thinking they can stop the Waaagh, but we ain't stoppin', we ain't slowin', we ain't never gonna stop fightin'." He lifted his massive power claw, its jagged, brutalized edges glowing faintly with stolen energy, and pointed toward the hive like a war god delivering judgment upon the doomed. Firefang inhaled deeply, savoring the thick, acrid air of war, feeling the heat of battle in his very bones, letting the raw, violent energy of the Waaagh course through his blood like fire. This was not a battle for land, not a conquest for resources, not a campaign of strategy. This was a moment, a perfect, violent moment, where all that mattered was the clash, the roar, the sheer ecstasy of war. And then, with a single, earth-shaking roar, he charged. The orcs surged forward, their war cries rippling through the battlefield like the call of some primordial beast, their weapons raised high, their feet thundering against the shattered remains of the once great city. The ground itself seemed to buckle beneath their charge, dust and rubble exploding into the air as the first of their number reached the crumbling defenses. The siege had truly begun. Above, upon the walls, Holt exhaled slowly, watching the oncoming tide with the weary gaze of a man who had long since come to terms with his own mortality. "There it is," he murmured, his voice barely audible against the howling wind. "The end of all things." Lieutenant Garen Voss, standing beside him, swallowed hard, his grip tightening around his lasgun. "Sir," he said, his voice edged with something approaching desperation, "we can still hold. We have the higher ground. We have the last of our heavy bolters. If we can just hold them at the gate, we might—" "No," Holt interrupted, shaking his head. "You don't understand. You're still thinking of this as a battle. This isn't a battle, Lieutenant. It's a storm. It's a force of nature, a fire that cannot be stopped. We are not soldiers standing against an enemy. We are embers caught in the wind, flickering, waiting to be extinguished." Voss hesitated, as if searching for some argument, some counterpoint that could undo the finality in the commissar's voice. "Then what do we do?" he asked. His voice softer now, not a plea for tactics, but a question of existence itself. Holt turned to him then, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark with the weight of 100 battlefields, 1,000 deaths, a lifetime spent staring into the abyss. "We fight," he said simply, "not because we will win, not because there is hope, but because that is what men do when they stand upon the edge of oblivion. They fight, knowing that they will die, knowing that they will be forgotten, knowing that there is no victory waiting beyond the flames. And in that defiance, in that final moment, there is meaning." Voss stared at him, his throat dry, his mind grasping for something to hold on to, some certainty in the commissar's words that he could cling to, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Aye," he said, voice steady now. "We fight." The first orcs hit the walls like a tidal wave, crashing into the defenses with the sheer, reckless force of living weapons. The air erupted with the sound of las fire, of bolter rounds tearing through green flesh, of the wet, visceral crunch of bodies smashing against reinforced stone. Orc after orc threw themselves against the barricades, their roars undiminished, their momentum unstoppable. The hive trembled beneath the weight of their assault. Above them, Holt raised his bolt pistol, aiming with the calm precision of a man who had long since surrendered his soul to the Imperium. His first shot punched through the skull of a massive orc, sending it sprawling backward into the horde. His second tore through another's chest, a gaping hole where its crude iron heart had once beaten. And still they came. Firefang, at the heart of the storm, laughed. The Waaagh was here. The walls of Hive Caridin groaned beneath the weight of war, their once proud defenses crumbling like the bones of an aging titan, long past its years of strength, now faltering beneath the ceaseless, merciless assault of something far more ancient than the Imperium itself. The orcs came in an unbroken tide, a living avalanche of crude metal and unshackled fury, their war cries rolling across the city like an unstoppable wave, smashing against the last bastion of mankind's resistance, with the force of a storm that had been gathering since the dawn of time. The sky, already thick with the blackened breath of war, seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, something primal, something raw, as if the very air trembled beneath the sheer, undeniable will of the Waaagh, a force that was not mere strategy or conquest, but something far greater, something that existed simply because it could not be denied. The air smelled of burning metal and charred flesh, of ozone and blood, a potent mixture of destruction and desperation that coated the inside of the throat like a sickness, a bitter, choking reminder of the inevitability of death. Las fire streaked through the darkness, the brilliant lances of crimson light carving glowing paths through the battlefield, cutting down orcs by the dozens, their bodies collapsing into the dust like felled beasts, only for more to take their place. Heavy bolters roared, their deep guttural percussion a rhythmic mechanical hymn of defiance, hammering into the horde with unrelenting precision, turning green flesh into a mist of bone and meat. But it was not enough. Commissar Darnick Holt stood upon the parapets, his coat whipping in the furnace wind of war, his pistol raised, his aim unwavering, his expression one of cold, unshaken resolve. There was no fear in his stance, no hesitation in his movements, only the calculated certainty of a man who understood that his fate had already been sealed, that he was merely delaying the inevitable, holding the line not because he believed in victory, but because he refused to accept the alternative. A single bullet to the skull would be the easy way out, a coward's end, a quiet surrender to the black void that loomed just beyond the horizon. But Holt had never been a man of easy paths. He was a man of duty. A man who understood that the truest test of resolve was to stand when all others had fallen, to fight not for survival, but for the sheer, unyielding principle of resistance itself. Lieutenant Garen Voss stood beside him, his lasgun clenched in trembling hands, his jaw set in grim determination, though his eyes, those young human eyes, still filled with the ghosts of what once had been, betrayed something deeper, something more fragile. There was a moment of silence between them, a pause, a breath caught in the maelstrom of violence, as though the war itself had allowed them one final instant to reflect, to speak, before the tide swallowed them whole. "Sir," Voss murmured, his voice barely audible beneath the ceaseless earth-shaking roar of the orcs' advance. "Do you think they feel fear? The orcs, I mean? Do you think they understand what death really is?" Holt did not answer immediately. He did not even turn to acknowledge the question, but merely continued to fire, his pistol cracking with the sharp finality of an executioner's hammer, each round finding its mark, each kill nothing more than a delay of the inevitable. And yet, despite his silence, something in Voss's words clung to his mind like a lingering shadow, a question that could not be ignored, a thought that clawed at the edges of his iron-wrought certainty. Finally he exhaled, slow and deliberate, his breath misting in the cold, ruined air of the hive. "No," he said, his tone devoid of doubt, yet laced with something else, something that could have almost been called reverence. Orcs do not fear death, because to them there is no such thing as death, not in the way that we understand it. To them battle is eternal. There is no past, no future, only the fight. They do not wonder about the end because they do not believe in the end. They believe in the Waaagh, in the fight, in the moment. And that is why we will lose, because for them war is not a means to an end. War is the end. The boss swallowed, gripping his weapon tighter, his fingers shaking with something beyond exhaustion, something beyond fear. "But if they don't fear death," he asked, "then what drives them? What keeps them fighting?" Holt finally turned then, his gaze meeting the younger man's, his eyes dark with understanding, with an acceptance that had long since consumed whatever idealism he had once carried in his youth. "Because war is joy to them," he said, his voice almost a whisper, but somehow heavier than all the gunfire that surrounded them. because they are what we have spent our entire history trying not to become. They are war. They are hunger. They are what happens when there is nothing left but the fight. And in that moment, the defenses broke. A great, terrible detonation ripped through the western gate, a cascade of fire and stone erupting into the sky as Firefang's war machine, a hulking, barely held together battle wagon covered in crude glyphs of fire and strength, smashed through the final line of fortifications. The war boss leaped from its summit, his massive power claw crackling with energy, his jagged-toothed grin stretched wide, his mechanical red eye burning with an insatiable lust for the kill. "Right then, boys," he bellowed, his voice rolling over the battlefield like a living force of nature. "Die Ummings. Think they can stop da Waaagh? We gonna show 'em what a real scrap looks like." He hit the ground like a meteor, his impact shaking the ruins beneath him, his laughter rising above the screams, above the gunfire, above the world itself. The orcs surged forward, smashing through the last of the Imperial lines, their war cries consuming the very sky. Holt turned back to Voss, his expression unreadable, his stance unwavering. "Do you understand now, Lieutenant?" he murmured. "Do you understand why we fight?" Voss did not speak. He did not need to, because at that moment, as the horde finally crashed against them like the breaking of a great dam, as Firefang's roar of triumph echoed across the shattered hive, as the world itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of war made manifest, there was nothing left to say. There was only the fight. There was only the Waaagh. The storm had broken. It did not arrive in the way the old tales spoke of. No sudden bolt from the heavens, no divine reckoning, no ethereal hand of fate reaching down to intervene. No, this storm had been coming for far longer than the men of Hive Caridon had realized. It had been stirring beyond the veil of sanity, building in the hearts of creatures who did not recognize fear, who did not bend beneath the weight of mortality, who did not contemplate the fragile poetry of existence. And now, like a long dormant volcano awakening after an eternity of silence, the Waaagh had come. The first of the orcs smashed through the last defenses like living artillery shells, their bodies propelled by sheer, unrelenting will, their rusted cleavers and brutal axes rising and falling with the force of an unstoppable avalanche. Each step they took sent the dust of a dying empire into the air, the echoes of a once proud civilization reduced to so much smoke and ruin beneath their boot. The walls of Caridon, the once mighty bulwark against the horrors beyond, now stood cracked and broken, their foundations trembling beneath the weight of something greater than war, something more profound than mere violence. This was not an invasion. This was not conquest. This was entropy made manifest. Commissar Darnick Holt watched the collapse unfold before him with an expression of quiet, unshaken resolve, the kind of stillness only a man who had long since discarded the illusions of hope could possess. His bolt pistol lay warm in his grip, its magazine half spent, its barrel blackened with the residue of 100 executed orcs. Yet it felt as insignificant as a matchstick against a hurricane. He exhaled slowly, the scent of burning flesh and charred metal thick in the air, his senses drowning in the sensory overload of a battlefield that had ceased to be a conflict and become something far more primal, a feeding ground for war itself. Beside him, Lieutenant Garen Voss still clung to his lasgun, his knuckles white, his body coiled with the tension of a man who had not yet learned to let go, a man who still believed in the possibility of something beyond death. There was something noble in that, Holt supposed. Something tragic. He had seen it before in younger men, in soldiers who had not yet come to understand that there was no heroism in last stands, no poetry in the final moments of the damned. There was only fire and blood and the quiet, inevitable realization that the universe did not care. The ground shook violently as Rukruk Firefang landed upon the shattered remains of the outer rampart, his massive power claw carving deep trenches into the stone beneath him, his jagged-toothed grin splitting his monstrous face like a wound carved into reality itself. His red, mechanical eye gleamed in the firelight, pulsing with raw, unfiltered joy, the kind of joy that only a creature utterly unburdened by doubt or hesitation could ever experience. Who are ya, humans? Put up a good scruff," Firefang bellowed, his voice booming across the ruined stronghold like the detonation of a planetary cannon, shaking the very bones of the defenders. "But I got bad news for ya. The sign diant of the Waaagh. The sign even the best bit. We just getting started." Holt lowered his pistol slightly, studying the orc with the clinical, measured gaze of a man who had long since learned to read the nuances of war, to see beyond the madness and the chaos, and recognize something deeper, something hidden beneath the layers of violence. Firefang was not merely a leader. He was not just another warlord, another brute, another creature to be put down in the long, bloody history of the Imperium's endless struggle. No, Firefang was something else entirely. The orc was thinking. That was what unsettled Holt more than anything else. Orcs did not plan. Orcs did not calculate. Orcs did not look upon a battlefield and see more than the immediate satisfaction of the fight before them. But Firefang was looking beyond this battle, beyond the blood and the fire, beyond the ruins of Hive Caradon. There was something in his stance, something in his gaze. A hunger not for victory, but for something greater. "Tell me something, Warboss," Holt said at last, his voice steady, unyielding, carrying across the carnage like the last whisper of an empire's final breath. "What do you see when you look at this battlefield? When you stand atop the corpses of the men who have fought and died here? When you hear the screams of the dying and the laughter of your kin? When you see the fire consuming the last remnants of this city? What do you see?" Firefang's grin widened. He tilted his head slightly, the crude servos of his mechanical eye whirring softly as he regarded the commissar with something dangerously close to amusement. What I see a right proper scrap. I see the biggest, lootest, burniest fight what's ever happened. I see the wall I always see, Humie. I see the wall I always see, Humie. Holt nodded slowly, as if expecting that answer, as if already knowing what it would be before the orc even spoke. "And what happens when this Waaagh ends?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less sharp, no less cutting. "What happens when this world is burned, when the fight is over, when the last man falls and there is nothing left but silence? What happens then, Warboss?" For the first time, Firefang hesitated. It was not hesitation in the way a human might hesitate, not doubt, not uncertainty, not fear. It was something different, something deeper, something that Holt recognized as the faintest flicker of a realization. The kind of realization that comes to creatures who have never once questioned their nature. The Waaagh had never ended for Firefang before. There had always been another fight, another war, another world to conquer, another enemy to crush beneath the weight of sheer, unrelenting brutality. But Holt's question dug deeper than that. What happened when there was nothing left to fight? Firefang's grin faltered, only for the briefest fraction of a second, but it was there, a crack in the iron wall of his certainty, a fleeting moment where the orc saw something beyond the present moment, beyond the fires of war, beyond the battle that consumed him. And then, just as quickly, the moment was gone, swallowed by laughter, by the roar of a creature that refused to contemplate anything but the now, anything but the fight. "Ha ha, den we find a neuver Waaagh," Firefang roared, raising his claw high, the energy crackling against the blackened sky. "Because there's always a neuver Waaagh. There's always more fightin', and if there ain't, we make more." Holt did not react, did not move, did not speak. He simply watched as the orc turned, his warriors swarming past him like a tidal wave, pouring into the final stronghold of Caradon, their war cries shaking the very foundations of the world. And as the city fell, as the fire spread, as the echoes of battle consumed the last remnants of resistance, Holt understood. Firefang had lied. Not to Holt, not to his warriors, not even to the universe itself. He had lied to himself, because deep down, beneath the roaring laughter, beneath the insatiable hunger for war, beneath the unbreakable certainty of an orc, Firefang had seen the truth. The Waaagh would end, and when it did, there would be nothing left. The ruins of Hive Caradon burned in the twilight, the skeletal remains of its once proud spires standing as blackened sentinels against a sky choked with fire and smoke, their jagged edges illuminated by the distant glow of raging infernos that consumed what little remained of imperial defiance. The city, once a monolithic testament to mankind's unyielding will, now lay hollowed and broken, its foundations crumbling beneath the weight of war, its streets littered with the corpses of the fallen, both human and orc alike, while the acrid scent of charred flesh and melted steel hung thick in the air, like the ghost of a world that no longer existed. The echoes of the Waaagh still reverberated through the ruined avenues, though no longer as a battle cry, no longer as the deafening roar of an unstoppable tide, but as something deeper, something more insidious. The orcs had won. That much was undeniable. The final bastions of the Astra Militarum had crumbled, their last strongholds breached, their last warriors slain or scattered like leaves upon a storm, their banners trampled beneath the boots of a species that did not care for history or remembrance, only for the fight itself. But even in victory, something lingered, something that gnawed at the edges of the war boss's mind, something that even the scent of blood and the weight of his triumph could not erase. Firefang stood upon the remains of the Hive's central citadel, his massive frame silhouetted against the burning skyline, his armor streaked with blood. some of it his, most of it not, his red mechanical eye whirring softly, its crude servos adjusting as he surveyed the wreckage of the city he had conquered. His massive power claw twitched absently at his side, the energy field crackling weakly, spent from the battle, but still humming with a quiet, waiting hunger, as if demanding more, as if unsatisfied by the slaughter that had already taken place. The war boss exhaled slowly, a deep guttural rumble that was neither a growl nor a sigh, but something in between, the sound of something unspoken, something unresolved. Below him, his boys still reveled in their victory, their guttural laughter echoing through the ruins, their crude, brutal celebrations turning the shattered remains of the city into a playground of destruction. They tore apart the corpses of fallen humans, smashing skulls with glee, stripping armor for trophies, firing their weapons into the air in mindless exhilaration, their joy unburdened by thought, their triumph as simple and instinctual as their hunger for war. And yet, Firefang did not laugh. He did not cheer. He did not revel in the way he once had, because the fight was over, and that was a thought that unsettled him in a way he could not put into words. It was not fear. Orcs did not fear. It was not doubt. Orcs did not doubt. It was something deeper, something older, something he could not name. It was the same feeling he had in the moments just before the first charge, the feeling that had been growing louder and louder in his mind and his bones, in the very core of his being. It was the feeling that had driven him here, that had pulled him across the stars, the whisper that had echoed in his skull long before this battle had even begun. The Waaagh would end, not today, not tomorrow, but one day. One day there would be no more enemies left to fight, no more worlds left to burn, no more humies left to crush beneath his boot. One day there would be nothing but silence. He clenched his fist, the claw grinding against itself, sparks spitting from its joints as the servos whined in protest. He could feel it now, that moment creeping closer, that terrible, gnawing truth that he refused to acknowledge. He had never thought about the end before. Orcs did not think about endings. Orcs lived for war, for the fight, for the endless, exhilarating rush of battle. But what happened when the fight was gone? A voice broke his thoughts, rough and deep, yet tinged with something almost resembling curiosity. Big Meek Gitzcrag stomped up beside him, his crude mechanical limbs clanking with every step, the massive burnasaw strapped to his back, still glowing with the heat of battle, his beady eyes scanning the horizon with a mixture of satisfaction and expectation. "Hoi, boss," Gitzcrag grumbled, his thick fingers tapping against the side of his reinforced skull. "Dis was a good fight, best fight I seen in a long while. Lot of crumpin', lot of burnin', lot of lootin'. But what's next?" Firefang turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting toward the mech, his single organic eye narrowing ever so slightly. "What's next?" he repeated, his voice quieter than usual, as if testing the weight of the words, as if trying to find meaning in them that he had not considered before. "We's already won. Dis city's ours. Dis planet's ours. We's the biggest, the strongest, the burniest boys in the whole damn galaxy. What else is there?" Gitzcrag frowned, rubbing his chin with an oil-streaked hand, his mechanical eye clicking softly as he processed the question. "Well, "There's always an over fight," he said after a moment, his voice slower now, more thoughtful, as if realizing something himself. "There's always more humies out there, more bug things, more othagits what need a good stompin'. We just gotta find 'em." Firefang nodded absently, but something in the words did not sit right with him, because this was not just another fight. This had been different. This had felt different. This battle had not been about loot or conquest, or even the joy of smashing humies into paste. This battle had been about something else, something deeper, something that Firefang had felt in his bones long before his boots touched the ground of this world. It had been about the fire, about the legend, about Gork's burning gaze. He turned back toward the city, his red eye flickering, the mechanical iris dilating as he scanned the ruins, as if searching for something that he knew was there, but could not yet see. The whisper was louder now. It had been faint before, like the distant crackle of a fire on the horizon, but now it was close. Now it was calling. He grinned then, slow and deliberate, his massive teeth gleaming in the flickering firelight. "There's more air," he muttered, his voice low, almost reverent. "There's something big, something burnin', something meant for me." Gitzcrag tilted his head, frowning. "Meant for you, boss. Whatcha mean?" Firefang did not answer, because he knew, deep down, beneath all the fightin', all the crumpin', all the shoutin' and killin', that this was what he had been looking for all along. This was why the Waaagh had come here. Not just for the fight, but for something bigger, something stronger, something burnin'. The fires of Hive Caridon still raged, but now they were no longer the fires of battle, no longer the reckless infernos of bolter blasts and searing promethium. They were the fires of aftermath, slow and relentless, devouring what little remained of the once grand imperial city, reducing its towering spires to skeletal husks, its streets to charred wastelands of ash and ruin. The sky, once a deep void of infinite darkness, now pulsed with the sullen, reddish glow of the embers, as though the very heavens themselves had caught fire, as though the gods of war had turned their gaze upon this broken world and decided to let it burn. Rook Firefang stood atop a shattered walkway, a relic of the Hive's once thriving infrastructure, its bridges and towering platforms now fractured and hanging over the abyss below. He surveyed his victory with a heavy, contemplative silence, his massive form outlined against the flickering ruins, his red mechanical eye glowing faintly in the darkness like the last ember of a dying forge. His power claw twitched idly, its rusted servos clicking with the steady rhythm of a machine at rest, but beneath the surface something in him still burned, something deep and ancient and unfulfilled. The Waaagh had won. The humies were dead or dying, their stronghold reduced to rubble, their weapons stripped from their corpses, their banners trampled into the dust. The orcs had taken everything worth taking, and the few surviving Imperial machines were being broken down for scrap, their wreckage repurposed into crude, ramshackle contraptions that would roll out into the stars, ready to bring war to some new battlefield, some new planet, some new fight. But as Firefang stood there, watching the flickering flames cast long, twisting shadows across the ruins, he felt something gnawing at the edges of his mind. something deeper than the joy of battle, something colder than the heat of war. He had never felt it before. It was a strange, alien thing, this silence that followed victory, this hollow quiet that came when the last shot had been fired, when the last enemy had fallen, when the last screams of defiance had faded into the wind. The battlefield was supposed to be alive, a roaring, chaotic thing, a living storm of fury and fire, an endless, deafening chorus of metal and war cries and booming Dhaka. But now the storm had passed, and in its wake there was only this emptiness, this vast and formless absence, like a great machine that had suddenly lost its purpose, like a weapon that had no enemy left to kill, and Fire Fang hated it. Something deep in his bones told him this wasn't how it was supposed to be, that the fight should never end, that the Waaagh should be eternal, a never-ending march of battle and blood and victory. But here he was, standing amidst the ruins of his own triumph, and for the first time in his life he felt still. A heavy clanking noise echoed from behind him, the unmistakable sound of crude mechanical limbs stomping across broken stone, and he turned his head slightly as Big Mech Gitskrag approached, his burna saw still dripping with molten slag, his armor streaked with soot and blood, his mechanical eye flickering as he took in the view of the ruined city. "Oi, boss," Gitskrag grunted, coming to a halt beside him, his thick fingers rubbing at the side of his head like a machine still warming up after a long shutdown. "The boys is rounding up the last of the loot, busting up what's left of the humid teg. Should be done by morning. Den we's packing up, yeah. Heading to the next scrap?" Firefang didn't answer immediately. His organic eye narrowed slightly, his gaze still locked on the distant flames, watching as the last embers of the hive city flickered and died like dying stars in a collapsing galaxy. The words echoed in his skull. The next scrap, the next fight, the next war. But for the first time they did not ignite the hunger they once had. Gitskrag frowned, his mechanical fingers flexing absently, a nervous tic he had developed over years of tinkering and building and breaking things apart. "Boss," he grunted again, tilting his head. "You all right?" Firefang exhaled slowly, the breath heavy and strangely deliberate, as though he were forcing himself to pull the words from some deep, unspoken place. "We's been fighting all this time," he muttered at last, his voice lower than usual, more measured, more thoughtful. "We's been burning, smashing, looting. Done what we always do, done what we was made for." Gitskrag nodded eagerly, his jagged teeth gleaming in the firelight, his mechanical limbs clanking as he shifted his weight. "Yeah, we did. We crumped 'em good. What's the problem?" Firefang's claw clenched, the rusted servos groaning under the pressure. "Den why's it feel like dairy's something missing?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud before the storm, a heavy, unnatural weight in the silence that followed. And, for the first time in his life, Big Gitskrag did not have an answer. Because he had felt it too. It was not something an orc should feel. Orcs weren't supposed to think about these things. Orcs weren't supposed to wonder, weren't supposed to question, weren't supposed to feel the weight of the fight ending and find something strange and wrong about it. But as the silence stretched between them, As the distant fires flickered like dying memories, Gitscrag realized he had felt that same emptiness, that same odd, quiet thing that lingered in the wreckage of their victory. Firefang turned then, his red eye flaring, his massive jaw setting with new resolve, a thought forming in the depths of his mind, an idea that burned brighter than any fire, something that had been calling him all along. "Dis Waaagh ain't done," he growled, his voice carrying a new weight, a new purpose. "There's something there, something big, something bigger than this fight, bigger than this planet." Gitscrag's metal hand clenched into a fist, his circuits sparking slightly. "Boss," Firefang grinned, slow and deliberate, his power claw twitching with anticipation. "Deers of fire, air," Miek murmured, his voice quiet now, almost reverent. "A fire older than any Waaagh, older than any orc, older than this world. I can feel it, I can hear it callin'." Gitscrag frowned, shifting uneasily, his mind struggling to grasp the meaning of those words. But something in Firefang's tone, something in the way his glowing red eye burned like a beacon in the darkness, sent a shiver through his mechanical spine. "What kind of fire?" the mech asked slowly, his voice edged with something almost like fear. Firefang's grin widened. "Da kind that don't go out," he growled, and as the last embers of Hive Caridon smoldered into darkness, as the winds carried the smoke into the endless void above, as the shadows stretched long and deep across the ruins of a world now lost to history, the orcs had found something far greater than war. They had found a calling. The fires of Hive Caridon were dying, but the city was far from silent. The crackling embers whispered as they consumed the last remnants of civilization, their glow casting long, flickering shadows that stretched across the ruins like the skeletal fingers of forgotten gods. Smoke coiled through the shattered streets in thick, sluggish tendrils, wrapping itself around broken towers and fallen bridges as if reluctant to release the city from its grasp. The air was thick with the acrid tang of burned metal and seared flesh, the scent clinging to the shattered stone like an unwanted memory, a reminder that war did not simply kill, it lingered. But War Boss Rook Firefang did not linger. He strode through the wreckage with the unshakable certainty of something too big to be slowed by thought, too driven to be held by hesitation. His heavy boots crunched against the remains of imperial banners, the sigils of the Astra Militarum reduced to tattered scraps beneath his tread. His red mechanical eye flickered, scanning the ruined skyline, drinking in the devastation with the same satisfaction a smith might feel when inspecting a blade fresh from the forge. Testing the edge, feeling the weight, ensuring that it was properly tempered in the flames. But something else burned beneath that gaze. Something deeper than conquest, something more insatiable than mere victory. The fire was calling. It was not the fire of war, nor the fire of destruction. It was not the searing heat of Prometheum, nor the blinding fury of an orbital bombardment. No, this was a different fire, an older fire, a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface of this world long before the first bolter had been fired, long before the first imperial boot had touched its soil. It was a whispering fire, a waiting fire, a fire that did not simply burn, but beckon. And Firefang was listening. Behind him, big Metget's crag clanked along, his heavy mechanical limbs hissing as their crude pistons adjusted to the uneven terrain, his burner saw humming softly, still warm from its last victim. His face was set in a deep, contemplative scowl, an expression rarely seen on an orc, an expression that should not have existed at all. Orcs did not scowl in thought. They did not brood. They did not question. And yet here he was, trudging through the ruins, his thick, calloused fingers rubbing at the side of his scarred head, his mind wrestling with something that refused to be broken down, refused to be understood, refused to be ignored. "Boss," Gitzcrag muttered at last, his voice low, almost reluctant. "What exactly we looking for?" Firefang did not answer immediately. He stopped instead, standing atop a crumbling slab of ferrocrete, his massive power claw twitching idly, the metal grinding against itself with a low, guttural hum. The firelight reflected off his jagged-toothed grin, casting sharp, unnatural shadows across his face, making him look less like a creature of flesh and blood and more like something carved from the bones of war itself. "Dunno," he admitted, his voice slower than usual, more deliberate, more weighed down by something. "But it's here. I feel it." Gitzcrag shifted uneasily. "Bayu feel what, boss?" Firefang's red eye flared, the servos whirring as he turned his head toward the Mayak, and when he spoke, there was something unnerving about his voice, something heavier, something that should not have belonged to an orc, something that should have never been able to form in the mouth of a creature born for nothing but endless war. "Something big," he murmured. "Something old." Gitzcrag frowned, his mechanical eye flickering, scanning the ruins, his mind struggling against the creeping sensation at the edge of his awareness, a feeling he could not describe because it should not have existed at all. It was not fear because orcs did not feel fear. It was not doubt because orcs did not doubt. It was something else, something colder, something deeper, something that pressed against the back of his mind like the weight of something unseen standing just behind him. "Boss," he rumbled, his voice slow, careful. "Dis ain't right." Firefang laughed then, a low, guttural sound, not his usual roaring battle laughter, not the booming, joyful bark of a warlord in the heat of battle, but something different, something almost knowing, something that belonged to a creature that had glimpsed something beyond what it was supposed to see. "That's the best part," he muttered, and then he started walking. The lower levels of the hive were buried beneath centuries of ruin, collapsed streets and broken manufactorums forming a labyrinth of shattered ferrocrete and twisted metal, a graveyard of forgotten war machines and rusted relics from a dozen conflicts past. The air was different here, thick and still, like the breath of a creature waiting in the dark, something that had been sleeping for longer than memory, something that had not been meant to wake. Firefang pushed forward without hesitation, his massive boots crunching against ashen remains, his presence alone disturbing the silence in a way that felt unnatural, as though the mere act of being here was something that should never have happened. Gitzcrag followed, though now his fingers were clenched into fists, his mechanical eye flickering erratically as the creeping sensation grew stronger, pressing against the edge of his mind like a sound just beyond the range of hearing. And then they saw it. At the heart of the ruins, buried beneath the bones of the city, the fire burned. It was not a normal fire. It did not flicker, did not waver, did not dance with the restless hunger of flame as it devoured fuel. No, this fire was still, a perfect, unmoving sphere of raw, pulsing heat, suspended in the air as though the laws of reality had forgotten to apply to it. It did not belong here. It did not belong anywhere. It was a thing that should not exist. Firefang stopped, his massive frame utterly still, his claw hanging loosely at his side, his eye locked onto the impossible flame before him, and for the first time in his life, he was silent. Grimdark stared, his jaws slack, his mechanical limbs frozen, his mind screaming to move, to do something, to break this moment before it swallowed him whole. But then Firefang took a step forward. Grimdark reached out instinctively, his voice hoarse, almost desperate. "Boss." Firefang did not stop. The fire did not move, did not react. But something else did. Something beneath them. The ground shook. Not the shake of crumbling ruins, not the tremor of a collapsing structure. This was something else. This was something waking up. Firefang grinned, slow and deliberate, his red eye flaring brighter than ever, his claw clenching with the sound of grinding metal. "Sure it is," he murmured, his voice filled with something deeper than war, deeper than rage, deeper than the Waaagh itself. And then the world roared. The world beneath Hive Caradon was alive in ways that no world should be. It was not the life of growing things, nor the hum of industry, nor even the restless stirring of creatures that lurked in the darkness. No, this was something deeper, something ancient, something that had slumbered for so long that even the echoes of its existence had faded from history, leaving behind only whispers in the bones of the world. And now it was waking. The ground trembled, not with the violent unpredictability of an earthquake, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of something rising from below, something that had waited, watching in the silence, patient as the stars burned and died, as empires rose and crumbled into dust. The air grew heavier, thick with the taste of burning metal, the acrid scent of something deeper than fire, something older than war itself. And in the center of it all, suspended above the shattered ruins, the flame burned, not wavering, not flickering, but steady, unmoving, absolute. War Boss Rook Firefang stood at the edge of that fire, his massive frame outlined in the pulsing glow, his jagged teeth gleaming in the unnatural light, his red mechanical eye reflecting the impossible sight before him. His power claw twitched, not in hesitation, not in fear. Orcs did not feel fear, but in something else, something that should not have been possible in a mind made for nothing but war. He felt small, not weak, not afraid, but small. It was a feeling that no orc had ever known, that no orc should have known, because to orcs the universe was not vast, it was not unknowable, it was not some infinite sea of cosmic questions waiting to be answered. The universe was simple. The universe was war, and war was everything. And yet, as Firefang stared into the depths of that fire, As he felt the pulse of the thing beneath him, the thing that was waking, he understood something that no orc had ever understood. There were things older than war. Behind him, Big McGitzcrag shifted uneasily, his mechanical eye flickering, his crude augmetics humming with nervous energy, his thick fingers clenching and unclenching as though his mind was grasping at something it could not quite hold on to. He was a builder, a maker of things, a creator in the only way an orc could be, and yet as he stared at the fire, he felt something fundamentally wrong. Something that no amount of scrap and bolts and Daka could fix. "Boss," Gitzcrag muttered, his voice rough, uncertain, alien in its hesitation. "Dis ain't right." Firefang's grin widened, slow and deliberate, his red eye flaring, his massive boots grinding into the trembling stone beneath him. "That's the best part," he said again, the same words as before, but now there was something different in them, something deeper, something almost reverent. Gitzcrag's fingers twitched, his burner saw humming weakly, his circuits struggling to process what his eyes were seeing, what his gut was telling him, what his instincts were screaming at him to do. "Boss," he tried again, his voice more urgent now, more raw, more afraid. "I don't know if we should be here. Dis ain't a Waaagh. Dis ain't right." Firefang laughed, a slow rolling chuckle that echoed through the ruins, that seemed to shake the very stones around them. A laugh that did not belong to an orc, because there was something else in it, something older than him, older than his kind, older than the Waaagh itself. "That's where you're wrong," Firefang murmured, his voice quieter now, but heavier, deeper, a weight settling into every syllable. "Dis is the biggest Waaagh of 'em all. Dis is something bigger than all the fights we ever fought, bigger than all the burning, bigger than all the crumping. We's been chasing this fight since the first orc ever swung a chopper, since the first Waaagh ever crashed across the stars." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his massive frame casting an impossibly long shadow in the firelight. "We just didn't know it till now." Gitzcrag shuddered. Orcs did not shudder. The ground groaned beneath them, something deep and vast shifting in the darkness below, something so massive that even the stone above it seemed fragile, seemed as insignificant as a blade of grass before a stampeding beast. The walls of the hive shook, cracks forming in the stone, dust and debris spilling from the ceiling like sand through an hourglass. And then the fire spoke. It was not a voice, not in the way that humans spoke, not in the way that orcs bellowed across battlefields, not in the way that any living thing had ever made itself heard. It was a presence, a force that pressed against the inside of Firefang's skull, that rumbled through the marrow of his bones, that pushed into the empty spaces between thoughts and filled them with something else, something vast, something waiting. "You have come." Firefang's red eye flared, his teeth clenching, his fists tightening, but not in resistance, not in defiance, not in the way he had always fought against the things he did not understand, because he understood this. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Gitzcrag staggered back, his augmetics sparking, his breathing ragged, his vision swimming with something that should not have existed, something that twisted the very air around them, something that was not meant to be seen. Boss! The fire flared. The world split open. The thing beneath them moved. And Fire Fang laughed. It was a laugh that shook the air, that sent cracks racing through the ruins, that split the silence like a blade through flesh. It was a laugh that did not belong to one orc, or one war boss, or even one Waaagh. It was the laugh of something new, something old, something that had waited, patient and hungry, in the dark for so long that even time had forgotten its name. And now it had a name again. He had Fire Fang. Its crags screamed. The world burned, and the Waaagh became something more, something endless, something eternal, something that would never, ever stop, not until the stars themselves had burned away, not until there was nothing left but fire, not until the universe itself had learned what it truly meant to Waaagh. And so the fire spread,